The message came across the radio in the dark. Somewhere in the Strait of Malacca, in the long blank hours between one day and the next, a signal broke through the static. It was 1947 or thereabouts. The war had ended 2 years before, and the sea lanes of Southeast Asia were reopening slowly, cautiously, like a door that had been shut a very long time. Ships moved through those waters again, cargo vessels, freighters, vessels of uncertain registry and uncertain purpose, threading the narrow passage between the Malay Peninsula and the island of Sumatra, carrying goods whose origins no one examined too closely. The signal that came through the shortwave was not a weather report. It was not a position update, or a request for guidance, or any of the routine communications that filled those frequencies in the ordinary run of hours. It was something else. Something that the radio operators who received it would spend the rest of their lives trying to find the right words to describe. The transmission began in Morse code. It named a ship. It named a destination. And then it said, "All officers, including captain, are dead, lying in chart room and bridge, possibly whole crew dead." There was a pause in the transmission. A pause long enough that the men listening must have wondered whether the signal had died, whether the sender had collapsed, whether whatever had happened aboard that vessel had already taken its toll on the one person still capable of sending a message to the outside world. Then the code resumed. 2 words, perhaps the last 2 words the sender would ever form. "I die." And then nothing. Nothing but the hiss and crackle of the open frequencies, the white noise of an ocean that kept its own counsel, that had always kept its own counsel, that knew things about those waters that no radio signal could ever fully transmit. You are here, at the beginning of that silence. You are listening to the space where the signal used to be. And somewhere out there, on a ship called the Ourang Medan, something has ended. The question that will take you through the hours ahead is not simply what happened. The question is whether any of this happened at all. Let that question settle around you like the dark settles over open water. Gently, without urgency. There is no hurry, here at the edge of the unknown. There never is. You find yourself on the edge of something vast. It is 1947, and the world is exhaling. 6 years of mechanized destruction have ended in ash and exhaustion, and now the shipping lanes of the world are being slowly reclaimed by commerce, by necessity, by the slow, patient resumption of ordinary life. The Strait of Malacca is one of the busiest seaways on the planet. It always has been. For 2,000 years and more, ships have moved through these waters, threading between the long green coastlines of Malaya and Sumatra, carrying spices and silk and tin and rubber, carrying the ambitions of trading empires, carrying the quiet hum of the world's need to exchange goods across distances. The strait is narrow enough in places that you can feel the presence of both shores at once. The air here carries the scent of warm salt water and something green and heavy from the land, a density of vegetation that clings to the edges of the sea. In the daytime, the water is a deep opaque green. At night, it is simply black, carrying the reflections of stars in long broken streaks. Into this world came the Ourang Medan. Or perhaps it did not. Perhaps the ship existed only in the stories that gathered around its name, accumulating detail the way any legend does, absorbing the fears and fascinations of the people who repeated it. The uncertainty is part of the story. The uncertainty, in fact, is the story. What is known, or what is claimed, is this. Sometime in the late 1940s, 2 American vessels received a distress call from a Dutch freighter. The name of the ship translates, from Malay, as Man from Medan. Medan is a city on the northeastern coast of Sumatra, a colonial trading city built by the Dutch in the 19th century. A city of heat and commerce, and the particular exhaustion that comes from building an empire in a climate that resists it. The distress call named a ship. The distress call described a situation without description, really. Officers dead, crew dead, the sender themselves dying, and then the sender died, or stopped transmitting, or both, and the 2 receiving vessels turned toward the coordinates that could be inferred from the signal, moving through the night water toward a ship that no one aboard could have known was a mystery in the making. You are moving with them now. The night air is warm and carries the smell of the sea. There is no tension in the movement, only the slow, purposeful progress of a vessel through dark water, guided by the certainty of a heading, uncertain about everything that heading leads toward. The engines make their steady sound, the water parts and closes behind. If you enjoy listening to stories like this, tales of the sea, mysteries from the deep passages of history, stories that drift between the documented and the dreamed, subscribe. Stories like this one arrive every week, waiting for nights exactly like this one. And now, settle deeper into where you are. The water is dark ahead. Whatever waits on the Ourang Medan has been waiting a long time. It can wait a little longer while you find your way to the threshold of it. If you're drifting now, let yourself go. Subscribe so the next story is waiting when you return. Sleep well. The Strait of Malacca is not a simple passage. It has never been simply a passage. To move through it is to move through accumulated time, through layer upon layer of history deposited like sediment at the bottom of a slow river. You feel it even at night, even when you cannot see the shores, when the strait is just a corridor of black water between two invisible coastlines. The air carries something that is not merely humidity, not merely the warmth of the tropics. It carries the residue of what has happened here across centuries. It carries the weight of every vessel that has moved through this channel and every secret those vessels bore. 2,000 years ago, the traders of the Tamil kingdoms knew this passage. They called it the Route of Winds, navigating it by the monsoon seasons, waiting in small harbour towns on either shore for the great seasonal reversals that would carry them north or south, east or west. The spices of the Moluccas moved through these waters, cloves from Ternate, nutmeg from Banda, pepper from the coastal farms of Sumatra, moving toward the markets of India and Arabia, and eventually the great consuming appetite of Europe. The strait was a valve in the circulatory system of the ancient world. Open it, and the world's commerce flowed. Close it, and something essential stopped. The city of Malacca, which gave the strait its European name, was built on that understanding. In the 15th century it was perhaps the greatest trading port in the world, a city of 40-odd languages, a city where you could buy goods from China and India and Arabia and Java all within a morning's walk. The sultans of Malacca understood that controlling the strait did not mean owning it. It meant being the place where things paused, where goods changed hands, where merchants rested and took on water and made the arrangements that moved their cargo forward. To be the pause in the flow was to be indispensable. To be indispensable was to be wealthy beyond the ordinary capacity of wealth to accumulate. Then the Portuguese came, in 1511, and took Malacca by force. The Dutch followed, and after the Dutch the British. Each colonial power understood what the sultans had understood before them. The strait was not simply a route, it was a choke point. Control the choke point and you controlled the flow of everything that mattered in the Eastern Hemisphere. The history of colonial violence in Southeast Asia is, in large part, the history of different imperial powers attempting to control the valve, to hold it long enough to extract the wealth that passed through it, to impose on the movement of goods and people the tariffs and the restrictions and the particular forms of exploitation that empire required. By 1947, the colonial era was ending, or was at least beginning its long, complicated ending. The Dutch were still in the Netherlands East Indies, which would become Indonesia, but their grip was loosening under the pressure of a nationalist movement that had been gathering force for decades, and had found new energy in the aftermath of the Japanese occupation. The British were still in Malaya, but the promises made during the war years were creating obligations that would eventually resolve into independence. The French were still in Indochina, the Americans were in the Philippines. But something had shifted in the long grammar of empire, and everyone could feel it even if no one quite knew what sentence it was building toward. Ships moved through the strait in this climate of transition. Freighters and tankers and passenger vessels, some flying the flags of colonial powers, some flying flags of convenience that revealed nothing about their actual ownership or purpose. The strait had always attracted ambiguity. Vessels of uncertain registry, cargo of uncertain description, routes that diverged from their stated purposes for reasons that did not appear in any manifest. The post-war years intensified this ambiguity. The war had disrupted every ordinary channel of commerce and governance and had created, in its aftermath, a vast informal economy of surplus materials, salvaged goods, and the kind of trade that requires darkness rather than daylight. The water itself in the strait has a particular quality at night. In the daytime, the sea here is a deep opaque green, thick with the plankton and sediment of the shallow tropical shelf, coloured by the rivers that drain into it from both shores. At night, the colour disappears entirely, and what remains is a blackness that is neither the deep black of ocean water nor the lighter black of shallow coastal water, but something in between, something that carries the depth of the continent's drainage and the warmth of the tropical air above it. You cannot see what is in this water. You move through it by sound and by instrument and by the lights of other vessels, and you trust that the chart you are following reflects a reality that the water is not showing you. The Ourang Medan, if it existed, was part of this world. A Dutch-registered freighter, or so the story goes, moving through the strait in the years just after the war. No one has been able to locate its registration with complete certainty. No one has been able to find a manifest that confirms its cargo, or a port record that confirms its route, or a company record that confirms its ownership. The ship exists in the story the way a current exists in still water. You can feel the effect of it without being able to put your hand on the thing itself. And yet the effect is there. The story of the Ourang Medan has been told and retold for more than 70 years, across multiple languages and multiple traditions of maritime storytelling, and it has retained its essential character through all those retellings in a way that suggests either that the original events were striking enough to resist distortion, or that the story serves some deep human purpose, well enough that each teller has an interest in preserving it intact. Either possibility is interesting. Either possibility is worth the night's consideration. You're in the strait now, in the dark of it, in the warm humidity of a tropical night at sea. The stars above the strait are particular stars, stars that have been navigated by for 2,000 years, stars that carry the accumulated weight of every vessel that has looked up at them from this narrow passage. They are not mysterious stars. They are the most patient of witnesses, having seen everything, having recorded nothing, having simply continued to burn in their courses while the world below went about its complicated and often violent business. The shore of Sumatra is somewhere to the south, invisible but felt in the quality of the air, in the warmth that rises off the land even at night, in the smell of the equatorial forest that drifts out over the water. The shore of the Malay Peninsula is somewhere to the north, equally invisible, equally present in the senses rather than the sight. Between them, the dark water carries you forward, toward whatever the Ourang Medan left behind, or toward the place where the Ourang Medan was always only a story, well told, deeply felt, stubbornly unverifiable. What was aboard the Ourang Medan, if the ship existed, moved through this strait without announcement. Whatever killed the crew, if the crew died as described, did so in waters that had seen many deaths, that had received the weight of many ships, that had accepted the secrets of countless cargoes without comment or testimony. The strait does not speak. It has never been a talking water. It is a passage, and its nature is passage, and what passes through it does so and is done. Either way you are moving, and the night is long enough to hold all of it. The questions settle around you the way the darkness settles, not as a weight, but as an envelope, as the particular quality of the world when the daylight and its demands have been set aside. You move through the dark water, and ahead of you is the story, and the story is complete enough to sleep inside if you let it be. Radio in 1947 was a young enough technology that its mysteries still felt miraculous. The shortwave frequencies that carried ship-to-ship and ship-to-shore communication were shared and open, monitored by vessels across wide stretches of ocean. A signal sent from anywhere in the strait might be received hundreds of miles away, might be received by vessels whose operators had no reason to expect it, might arrive without context or precedent or any identifying information beyond what the sender chose to include. The airwaves were a commons, a shared property of the sea, and on that commons the Ourang Medan's final transmissions arrived like a stone dropped into still water, felt at the centre first, then rippling outward through the accounts of everyone who heard it or heard about it. Two vessels are most commonly named in the accounts that circulated in subsequent years. One is the Silver Star, an American merchant vessel. The other is a British ship sometimes named and sometimes not. The accounts differ on specifics, the exact date, the precise position, the number of vessels that received the transmission. Some versions of the story say the distress call was received by 2 American ships simultaneously. Others say only one vessel received the signal clearly enough to act on it. The discrepancy in the accounts is itself a feature of the story's character. It is a story that exists in multiple versions, none of which is authoritative, all of which agree on the essentials. What they agree on is the character of the message itself, the quality of it, the way it progressed from distress to something beyond distress. A distress call from a ship in trouble is a specific kind of communication. It follows a protocol, it uses standard terms, it conveys position and nature of emergency and request for assistance. The Ourang Medan's transmission followed this protocol in some respects, and departed from it in others. It identified the ship, it described the situation, but it did not request assistance in the ordinary way, did not say Mayday, did not follow the conventional structure of a maritime distress call. It stated facts, bleak, specific, final facts. The first part of the message was in Morse code, and it was recognizably urgent. It described a situation on the Ourang Medan in terms so stark they almost resisted description. All officers, including captain, are dead. The phrase carries its own particular weight when you hold it for a moment. Not one officer, not some, all. The captain and all of the officers who would ordinarily take turns on the bridge, in the chart room, in the spaces where a ship is navigated and commanded, all of them dead. The word all is the word that arrests attention. It implies simultaneity, or near simultaneity, a single event, or a rapid sequence of events that did not allow for response. And then the additional detail, lying in chart room and bridge, not fallen overboard, not missing, not unaccounted for, lying there, in the spaces where they should have been working. The specificity of the location is significant. The sender of the transmission knew where the bodies were. The sender had been there, or had been close enough to see. The sender was describing what they had personally observed. Possibly whole crew dead. The word possibly is one of the most haunting words in the transmission. It means the sender knew about the officers from direct observation. They had been to the chart room, had been to the bridge, had seen the bodies with their own eyes. But the rest of the crew, the men in the engine room and the holds and the quarters below decks, the sender could only speculate about. Or perhaps the sender was too weak by that point to have investigated the whole ship. Perhaps they had strength only for the radio room, for the instrument that would allow them to reach across the water to wherever someone might be listening. Then the pause. Accounts of the transmission describe a gap in the coded signal, a silence that stretched long enough to create uncertainty. Radio operators who have described the experience of receiving such a transmission talk about a silence that has a different quality from ordinary silence. The silence of an open frequency is full of static, of the ambient noise of the electromagnetic spectrum, of the small irregular sounds that remind you the frequency is alive even when no one is transmitting. The silence of a frequency that has just carried something terrible has a different texture. You hear the static differently when you know what was just encoded in it. The silence may have been the sender losing consciousness momentarily. It may have been the sender composing themselves for what they knew would be their final communication. It may have been the sender searching for words adequate to what they needed to say, discarding and finally arriving at the minimum necessary. And then after the pause, I die. 2 words in Morse code are not many words. The simplicity of the transmission in its final moment is perhaps its most powerful quality. A dying person could have said many things, could have named their family, could have asked for prayers, could have provided more detail about the situation, could have expressed fear or grief or any of the 1,000 things that a human being might be feeling in the last moments of life. The sender said 2 words. They were the most accurate 2 words available. They were the truth of the situation stated in its irreducible form. What the radio operators who received this thought in the moment of hearing it, we cannot fully know. We can imagine the quality of that moment, the recognition, the silence, the exchange of looks between the men in the radio room, the question of what to do, the knowledge that the coordinates implied in the transmission could be worked out, that a ship could be sent toward them, that there was a course of action available even in the face of something that defied ordinary categorization. There is always the impulse to act when the situation requires action. The signal had been received. Action was possible. A ship could turn. The Silver Star, or whichever vessel was closest, turned toward the coordinates. You are on that turning vessel now, in the radio room or on the deck, in the aftermath of having heard something that you do not yet have language for. The ship changes course beneath you. The engines continue their sound. The dark water receives the new heading without comment. There is something to notice here, something that the best investigators of this story have always noticed. The message, as transmitted, displays an odd combination of specificity and vagueness. It is specific about what happened, officers dead, lying in the chart room and bridge, but offers no explanation for how. It names the ship but provides no cargo or route information. It describes the result of a catastrophe without offering any cause, and it ends with 2 words that are simultaneously the most personal thing a dying person can say and the least informative. Was this a real transmission from a real dying man, a man who had survived whatever killed everyone else on the vessel, long enough to reach the radio room and send those final words? Or was it something constructed after the fact, a story assembled from the material of maritime horror to explain what someone had seen, or what someone needed others to believe they had seen? The question, like the transmission itself, leaves a pause after it, a space of static, a silence that is full of something. The question will follow you for the rest of this night. It is a quiet question. It does not demand immediate resolution. It simply rides alongside you in the dark, patient as the sea itself, waiting for you to come to your own resting place with it. Meanwhile, the vessel moves. The coordinates are ahead. Whatever the Ourang Medan holds, body or legend, evidence or ghost, is approaching at the speed of a ship through calm night water, at the pace of a story that has been travelling toward you for more than 70 years and has arrived, at last, at this quiet hour. You have arrived at the vessel, you are in the boarding party, and the Ourang Medan is directly ahead. The ship sits in the water strangely. A vessel at sea in normal circumstances has a particular life to it. The movement of crew on deck, the sound of machinery, the smell of fuel and cooking and human occupation, the 100 small signs that a vessel is inhabited and working and on its way somewhere. The Ourang Medan has none of these things. It floats. It is intact, as far as you can see in the light of the rescue vessel's lamps. No visible damage to the hull, no obvious reason for the distress call, no fire or flooding or structural failure that would explain the transmission that brought you here. The silence of it is the first thing. Not the ordinary silence of a ship running on reduced crew, not the silence of a vessel whose engines have been cut and whose crew are below, not any of the ordinary silences that a seafarer learns to read during years at sea. This is a silence that has a quality of completeness to it, as though the ship has moved past the ordinary possibility of sound into some condition that sound cannot enter. A vessel in that silence is a vessel that has stopped in some fundamental way that goes beyond the stopping of engines. A boarding party was assembled and sent across. The accounts of this crossing differ in detail, as accounts of the story always do. Some say the party crossed in a small boat, others that they were able to come alongside and board directly. But they agree that men crossed from the rescue vessel to the Ourang Medan, that they climbed aboard, that they moved through the ship from the point of boarding inward, and that what they found awaited them exactly where the transmission had said it would be. The captain was dead. He was in the wheelhouse, or near it, and he was dead in a position that did not suggest a peaceful dying. The accounts describe a face fixed in an expression of extreme distress, eyes open, arms extended forward or upward, the whole body arrested in the posture of recoiling from something. The word terror is used, or words that approach it without landing exactly on it. The accounts say the captain looked as though he had seen something that no one who had survived could describe, as though whatever he had confronted in his final seconds had left its impression on his face like an image pressed into wax. The officers were dead. They were in the chart room and on the bridge as the transmission had said, and they were dead in configurations that resembled the captain's, the fixed expressions, the open eyes, the postures of recoil, not collapsed in the ordinary way of exhaustion or illness. Arrested, the accounts suggest, in a moment of extreme reaction, as though they had been stopped mid-motion, stopped mid-breath, stopped in the instant between recognizing something and being able to respond to it. The crew were dead. Below decks, in the engine room and the quarters and the spaces a working cargo ship assigns to the men who keep it running, the crew were dead. Engine room workers who should have been tending the machinery were dead at their stations or fallen near them, in the postures of men who had died not slowly but suddenly, in the midst of doing the ordinary things their work required. There was no sign of a struggle, no evidence of any attempt to escape or to investigate what was happening. The men had simply stopped, where they were, in the middle of the task the hour had assigned to them. There was a dog aboard the Ourang Medan. A dog is mentioned in most of the accounts, and the detail has always seemed to carry particular weight, perhaps because the presence of an animal makes the scene more vivid, or perhaps because the death of an animal gestures toward the indiscriminate quality of what happened, that whatever killed these men did not distinguish between them and the animal that lived among them. The dog was dead. The dog's expression was described in terms similar to the human dead. The frozen posture, the suggestion of extreme distress in the final moment. Whatever arrived on the Ourang Medan, it did not spare the dog. What would you have thought standing in that engine room, in that cargo hold, in that chart room looking at the dead? The boarding party were experienced seafarers. They had seen things during the war years that would have prepared most men for most sights. But the accounts suggest that what they found on the Ourang Medan was different from ordinary death, in a way that was difficult to articulate. Not more gruesome, not more violent, different in some quality that had to do with the expressions on the faces of the dead, the positions of the bodies, the suggestion that something had come for these men simultaneously and completely, without warning and without the possibility of response. The bodies were cold. In the tropics, in the warmth of the Strait of Malacca, the bodies were cold. This detail has attracted much attention in subsequent years and is taken by some investigators as evidence that something unusual, chemically unusual, physically unusual, had occurred aboard the vessel. Bodies do not become cold quickly in that climate. The ambient temperature in the strait is warm enough that a body, even without its own heat, would retain warmth for some time after death. If the men had died recently enough that the transmission was still fresh in the memory of those who received it, the warmth of the air should have been sufficient to maintain some residual body temperature. The cold suggested something else. Either the men had died longer ago than the freshness of the transmission implied, or something about the manner of their death had accelerated the loss of heat in a way that ordinary death does not. A chemical reaction of the right kind can produce rapid temperature change. A gas expanding from pressure can be intensely cold. The cold bodies are the kind of detail that gestures toward a mechanism, toward a physical cause, without naming it. Or the accounts exaggerated. The cold bodies are also the kind of detail that a story reaches for when it wants to move from the merely terrible into the category of the genuinely inexplicable. Cold bodies in the tropics gesture towards supernatural cold, toward the kind of death that takes something more than ordinary heat away from a person. The detail may be accurate. The detail may be embellishment. In the absence of documentation, both possibilities remain equally available. The boarding party moved through the ship. They did not find an explanation. They found only the dead, in their strange postures, with their strange expressions, in a ship that was otherwise intact, in water that was otherwise calm, in an atmosphere that offered nothing in the way of a visible cause. The ship was not on fire, the hull was not breached. The machinery, insofar as it could be assessed without starting the engines, did not appear damaged. The Ourang Medan had the appearance of a ship that could continue its voyage if only its crew were not dead. What they did not find was cargo that explained itself. What they found in the holds was not described in detail, in most accounts, which is itself a detail worth noticing. A boarding party investigating a vessel in distress would ordinarily examine the cargo holds for damage or danger. The accounts of the Ourang Medan boarding do not describe what the holds contained. They describe the dead, the expressions, the cold, and then they become vague about the one element that might have provided the most useful information about what had happened. You stand now in the middle of the Ourang Medan, among the accounts of what was found there, and the accumulation of detail is like a room whose edges you cannot quite see. It is not a frightening room, at this distance, in this darkness, with the night air around you and the sound of water below. It is simply a room full of questions that open into other questions, each one leading deeper into the ship, deeper into the mystery, deeper into the strange and unresolvable heart of a story that has now been told and retold for more than 70 years. Rest in that room for a moment. You do not have to resolve anything tonight. The dead on the Ourang Medan have been at rest for a long time, in whatever resting place the story assigns them. You can rest too, here at the edge of the mystery. There is a particular vocabulary that human faces develop only in extremity. The faces of the dead on the Ourang Medan have been described many times, in many different versions of the story, and across all those versions a consistency emerges that is either the evidence of a real shared experience or the evidence that stories, when they circulate long enough, develop their own grammar, their own preferred details, their own way of achieving the effect they are after. The faces are described as expressing terror, or horror, or a kind of extreme surprise that shades into terror. The eyes are always open. The mouths are often open. The hands are described in configurations that suggest, without quite stating, that in the final seconds these men were trying to ward something off. To understand why these details matter, it helps to think about what an ordinary death at sea looks like. Men die at sea from many causes: mechanical failure, accident, cardiac arrest, the countless ways that a body can fail when it is pushed beyond its limits or simply reaches the end of its time. These deaths, as a rule, produce expressions and postures that reflect their causes. A man who dies of cardiac arrest in his sleep looks different from a man who falls from a height, who looks different from a man who drowns, who looks different from a man who is struck by failing machinery. Death at sea is not mysterious usually. It is explicable, traceable, readable in the evidence the body and the scene provide. The dead on the Ourang Medan were not readable in this way. Also, the accounts insist. They were dead in a way that their postures could not explain, that their surroundings could not explain, that the condition of the ship could not explain. The boarding party was looking at a scene whose elements did not resolve into a legible cause, and the faces of the dead were the most unreadable element of all. Consider what an expression of terror requires. It requires a nervous system that receives a signal, the signal of something frightening, something threatening, something that the organism identifies as requiring an urgent response. The expression of terror is the face's contribution to the fight-or-flight response, a collection of muscle contractions that evolved over millions of years as a signal to other members of a social species. Danger is here. The widened eyes to take in more light, the open mouth to allow for faster breathing, the particular tension around the brows and cheeks that communicates, across all human cultures and all human languages, the same essential message. For that expression to be frozen on a face at the moment of death requires that the cause of death arrived at the same moment as the cause of the expression. The thing that killed these men was the same thing that frightened them. Or rather, they saw it coming. They understood it was coming. They had a moment, perhaps only a moment, perhaps less, in which they processed what was about to happen to them, and their faces recorded that processing, and then they died, and the expressions remained, fixed in the muscles the way the final image in a camera is fixed on film when the shutter closes. What could do this to an entire crew simultaneously? What could arrive with such speed and completeness that every man aboard, in the wheelhouse, in the chart room, in the engine room, in the quarters below, died at the same instant or close enough to the same instant that the boarding party found them all frozen in the same moment of recognition? The simultaneity of the deaths is as remarkable as the nature of the expressions. A disease moves through a ship's crew over days. An accident takes one person, or a few people, in a specific location. A gas moving through the air systems of a vessel, a gas fast-acting and fatal, could reach every compartment of a ship within a very short time. One answer is poison. A gas, perhaps, something that moved through the ship's ventilation or rose from the cargo, or was released by some failure in the mechanical systems. A gas that was fast enough to incapacitate and kill before anyone could take a defensive action, fast enough that the men in the engine room and the men on the bridge all died within the same span of seconds or minutes. A gas, moreover, that had a particular effect on the nervous system, something that produced the extreme muscular contraction, the rictus of terror, not as an experience of terror itself, but as a physiological response to whatever the gas was doing to the body. Certain chemical agents produce exactly this effect. Nerve agents, developed in quantity by the German military in the 1930s and 1940s and available in considerable stockpiles at the end of the war, work by disrupting the normal function of the neurotransmitter acetylcholine, causing the nervous system to fire continuously, producing extreme muscular contractions. The expression of a person killed by a nerve agent can look, to an observer who does not know what they are seeing, like an expression of terror, not because the person experienced terror specifically, but because the muscles of the face contracted in the same patterns as the muscles of a terrified person. But here the accounts introduce a complication. If gas killed the crew of the Ourang Medan, then the gas should have killed the boarding party. The men who boarded the vessel moved through the same spaces where the dead lay in their strange postures. They breathed the same air that the dead men had breathed, and they lived. They boarded, and they survived, and they found the dead, and they went back to their vessel without apparent harm. Unless the gas had already dispersed by the time they arrived, a possibility depending on the type of gas and how long it had been since the deaths, unless the boarding party's exposure was brief enough and diluted enough that it did not reach a lethal concentration, unless, and this is the detail that appears in some versions of the story, the boarding party noticed something in the air but did not recognize it as dangerous until later. Some accounts describe the rescuers feeling an oppressive atmosphere aboard the Ourang Medan, a heaviness, a sense of something that their bodies registered as wrong, even if their minds could not name it. A quality of the air that was not quite a smell, and not quite a temperature, and not quite a sound, but something their bodies knew before their minds caught up with it. This could be the residual presence of a gas that had largely dispersed, but not entirely. It could be the psychological effect of encountering what they encountered. It could be a detail added in the retelling to convey what cannot otherwise be conveyed, that the atmosphere of the ship was wrong in ways that were not about any single, measurable quality. The faces of the dead on the Ourang Medan. You can hold them in mind without distress, here in the quiet of this night, here where the story has softened into something that is less about horror and more about the mystery at horror's heart. The faces are a question. They will always be a question. Whatever they saw in their last moment, whatever arrived in the air or in the ship's systems or from somewhere else entirely, it left no record except the record of their faces, and their faces have long since dissolved into whatever the story assigned them. In the years since the story first circulated, researchers and writers have pointed to a particular quality of the Ourang Medan's horror that distinguishes it from most maritime disasters, the fact that the victims could not have been rescued, because whatever killed them did so faster than rescue was possible. A ship that is sinking can sometimes be saved, or its crew can sometimes be saved if rescue arrives quickly enough. A fire can sometimes be fought. But whatever came for the crew of the Ourang Medan came so quickly that no one had time to send a conventional distress call, to take any defensive action, to do anything except what the one surviving radio operator managed to do, get to the transmitter and send the message. The faces of the dead are the evidence of that speed. They tell you, more eloquently than any technical description could, that what happened too fast to allow for anything but the most involuntary and immediate response. The widening of the eyes, the reaching of the hands, the expression that the face produces before the mind can form a word. What the faces leave behind tonight is the question they always leave behind, and questions at this hour are gentle things. They do not require immediate answers. They allow themselves to be held lightly, turned slowly, set down when the night grows heavy enough. Set them down now if you are ready. The ship will still be there when you return to it. The story has nowhere else to go. A ship's cargo is its reason for existing. Without cargo, a freighter is an expensive way to move air from one port to another. Without cargo, the route makes no sense, the economics make no sense. The whole logic of a commercial vessel moving through contested waters at a specific time falls apart. The cargo defines the ship as surely as the cargo defines the voyage. So what was the Ourang Medan carrying? The answer, in most versions of the story, is that no one will quite say. Or rather, the accounts that describe the boarding and the discovery of the dead tend to become vague, or to stop altogether, when they reach the question of the cargo. What was in the holds of the Ourang Medan has been the subject of more speculation than almost any other aspect of the story, because the speculation reveals something about how we understand the world, about what we believe powerful institutions are capable of, about what secrets a ship in 1947 might plausibly carry across the Strait of Malacca. The most widely circulated theory, in the years since the story first appeared in print, is that the Ourang Medan was carrying nerve agents or other chemical warfare materials. The Second World War had ended 2 years before the incident is supposed to have occurred, and in its wake enormous quantities of chemical weapons needed to be disposed of. The disposal was not always clean or documented. Ships carrying chemical waste disguised as ordinary cargo moved through the world's shipping lanes in the immediate post-war years, taking their contents to disposal sites that were sometimes at the bottom of the ocean. The numbers involved were staggering. Germany alone had produced approximately 70,000 tons of chemical weapons during the war. Japan had used chemical agents extensively in China. Allied forces had their own stockpiles. maintained against the possibility of a German or Japanese first use that never materialized. At the end of the war, all of this material needed to go somewhere. Official disposal sites were established, but unofficial channels also existed. Channels maintained by people who understood that the post-war world would be complicated by too much accountability for what had happened, and who preferred to let certain things disappear quietly into deep water. The theory holds that the Ourang Medan was one of these disposal ships, that it was carrying canisters or drums of chemical materials, possibly nerve agents, possibly the precursors of nerve agents, possibly some combination of volatile compounds that were dangerous in themselves and more dangerous in combination. That something happened in transit, a container seal failed, a drum was punctured by shifting cargo, the vibrations of the engine loosened something that had been sealed, and the gas or vapour or reaction product that was released killed everyone aboard with the speed and completeness that the accounts describe. This theory has a certain explanatory elegance. It accounts for the speed of the deaths. It accounts for the expressions on the faces of the dead, since nerve agents and some other chemical compounds produce extreme muscular contractions as part of their mechanism of killing. It accounts for the cold bodies, since some chemical reactions produce rapid temperature changes. It accounts for the vagueness about the cargo, since a ship carrying classified or illegal chemical materials would have operated under strict documentation controls or under no documentation at all, and it accounts for the explosion that followed the boarding party's investigation. Because there was an explosion, or so the story says, after the boarding party had investigated the vessel and returned to their own ship, and after the decision had been made to tow the Ourang Medan to port, smoke was seen rising from the holds of the freighter. The smoke thickened quickly, and before any action could be taken, the Ourang Medan exploded, or caught fire with a violence sufficient to consume the hull, and sank. If the Ourang Medan was carrying chemical warfare materials, the explosion would be explicable. Volatile compounds in a confined space, already showing signs of instability, heated by the fire that preceded the explosion, detonating in a chain reaction that left little behind. But the chemical cargo theory requires accepting a great deal on faith. It requires believing that a vessel carrying extremely dangerous materials was allowed to sail through one of the world's busiest shipping lanes without adequate safeguards. It requires believing that no port record, no maritime registry, no company document has survived to identify the ship and its cargo, despite decades of investigation. It requires believing that the governments or organizations responsible for the cargo chose to allow the story to circulate rather than to suppress it entirely. Or it requires believing that the governments or organizations responsible simply did not worry about a story that, absent any verifiable evidence, would remain permanently in the category of legend. A story without documentation is a story that can always be dismissed, and the Ourang Medan, whatever it carried or did not carry, has remained stubbornly, persistently without documentation. There is another cargo theory, quieter but equally persistent. In 1947, in the immediate aftermath of the war and the Japanese occupation of Southeast Asia, the region was awash in the materials of conflict: weapons, supplies, currency, valuables looted from occupied territories, the residue of years of total war. Much of this material moved through unofficial channels, transported by vessels whose paperwork described one thing while their holds contained another. The Ourang Medan, on this theory, was one of these vessels, carrying something valuable or illegal, something that could not be described in its manifest, something that powerful interests needed moved without official record. What happens to this theory when it meets the dead? It answers nothing about the cause of death. It simply provides a motive for silence, for the absence of documentation, for the vagueness of official records. A ship carrying smuggled goods might be allowed to disappear from the record without undue concern from those who had arranged the cargo. The deaths of the crew would be an inconvenience, but not a catastrophe, for people who had already decided that the cargo's secrecy was worth whatever complications arose in transit. You are in the hold of the Ourang Medan now, in the dark of it, in the quiet of it. Whatever it contains, in the version of the story you're inhabiting tonight, is present in the darkness around you. You cannot see it clearly. The darkness of a ship's hold at sea is a particular darkness, not the clean darkness of an unlit room, but a darkness textured by the smell of what has passed through the space before, by the sounds that travel through the hull from the water outside, by the slight constant movement of the vessel that tells you are not on land. Whatever was in the hold that night was present in exactly this darkness. It rested in the hull of the ship as the ship moved through the strait, as the crew went about their business above and below decks, as the night deepened and the stars moved in their courses, and the radio operator sat in the radio room monitoring the frequencies. The cargo was inert, as cargo always is, carrying its potential without expressing it, holding whatever danger it might have contained in the form of chemical structure, of physical state, of the mere fact of its being what it was. The hold is quiet. The ship rocks gently on the water, and above decks the night air is warm and the stars are out. The story is not finished yet, but there is no urgency in its unfolding. Whatever was in the hold has gone to the bottom of the strait, or it never existed, or it exists only in the archive of things that were true but left no evidence that survived to confirm them. Either way, it rests now. Smoke is a language. Mariners have read smoke for as long as ships have sailed, have learned to read the colour and density and movement of smoke the way a physician reads the signs of a body under stress. Black smoke means burning oil or rubber, something dense and petrochemical. White smoke means burning vegetation or wet materials, something that has water in it still. Grey smoke is ambiguous, could be almost anything. The smoke that rose from the holds of the Ourang Medan, according to the accounts, was described as coming up quickly, with a speed and volume that suggested something more than an ordinary fire in an ordinary cargo space, something that had been waiting under pressure for exactly the trigger it required. The boarding party had returned to their own vessel. The tow line was in place or was being attached. The accounts differ on exactly how far the salvage operation had progressed when the smoke appeared. What the accounts agree on is the rapid progression. Smoke appeared from the holds, the smoke increased in density and spread. Before any effective response was possible, flame followed the smoke, and before the flame could be addressed, the explosion came. What the explosion was like depends on which account you read. Some describe it as a single detonation, violent enough to lift portions of the ship's structure into the air. Others describe it as a rapid sequence of smaller explosions, as though successive containers of material were reaching their ignition point in sequence. Still others describe the fire simply overwhelming the ship so quickly that it seemed like an explosion, the hull becoming an inferno in such a short time that the distinction between fire and detonation became moot. The Ourang Medan did not sink the way a ship ordinarily sinks, taking on water, settling slowly, giving time for observation. It sank the way a ship sinks when the sinking is abrupt and complete, when whatever happens below the waterline happens all at once. The accounts say it went down quickly, they say it went down completely, they say it left behind the ordinary debris of a sunken vessel, floating materials, oil, the physical traces of destruction, but no witnesses, no survivors, no opportunity for further examination. The Strait of Malacca varies considerably in depth along its length. In the narrowest sections, particularly toward the southern end where it opens into the Singapore Strait, the water can be relatively shallow, shallow enough that a wreck would be locatable, potentially accessible with the diving technology of the 1950s and certainly with modern equipment. In other sections, particularly in the northern approaches where the strait widens toward the Andaman Sea, the depths can be considerable. If the Ourang Medan sank in deep water, the wreck would be extremely difficult to locate without modern deep-sea surveying equipment. No wreck has been identified with certainty as the Ourang Medan. Searchers and investigators over the decades since the story first circulated have found no wreck at coordinates that can be inferred from the accounts. This is not conclusive evidence that no wreck exists. The strait covers a large area, and its floor has not been comprehensively surveyed. But it adds another layer of absence to a story already characterized by what is missing. The explosion is, in narrative terms, the most convenient element of the story. It removes the evidence. If the Ourang Medan sank in the manner described, then the bodies of the dead, the cargo of the holds, the condition of the ship's systems, all the physical evidence that an investigation would require. All of it went to the bottom. What could not be examined could not be explained. What could not be explained could not be definitively attributed to any cause. Some investigators have noted the convenient quality of this ending, and have suggested that it is too convenient, that a story which needed to end without resolution would naturally include an event that removed all physical evidence. The explosion on this reading is not a reported fact but a narrative device, a way of closing the story at the point where it would otherwise require documentation that does not exist. A story that needs to remain mysterious must eliminate the evidence that would make it explicable. The explosion is exactly the right mechanism for this elimination. Others have noted that real disasters often include elements of convenient resolution, not because reality arranges itself for narrative convenience, but because the events that produce the most dramatic narratives are precisely the ones that include self-erasing elements. A fire that destroys evidence is genuinely more mysterious than one that preserves it. An explosion that sinks a ship is genuinely more complete as an ending than a ship that stays afloat to be examined. The Ourang Medan may have ended as described not because someone arranged for it to end that way, but because that is simply how it ended. What was aboard the Ourang Medan that could have produced an explosion of that magnitude, quickly enough that no effective response was possible? Ordinary cargo, textiles, metals, agricultural goods, does not typically explode, but certain chemical compounds, certain types of ordnance, certain combinations of materials that do not announce themselves in a ship's manifest could reach a threshold of instability in the presence of heat or water, or the friction of metal on metal during a fire. The cargo theory and the explosion theory reinforce each other. The one provides a mechanism for the other. The sea that received the Ourang Medan closed over it the way water always closes over everything it takes, without comment, without marking the spot, without retaining any external evidence of what had happened. The surface of the strait was the same after as before. The stars above it were the same. The warm air was the same. Whatever the Ourang Medan carried in its holds, whatever killed its crew, whatever caused the fire and the explosion and the sinking, all of it was now in the water, in the dark, in the place where things go when they are too complete to remain on the surface. What the boarding party took away from the Ourang Medan in the end was their lives and their accounts. The lives are the larger gift. The accounts are the thing that survived into history or into legend, or into the uncertain territory between the two where the Ourang Medan has always lived. They took back the memory of the dead in their postures of recoil, the memory of the cold that should not have been cold, the memory of a ship whose silence had been total and whose ending was absolute. You are on the surface still, above the place where the story sank. The water below is very dark and very deep and very quiet, and whatever it holds without sharing. Above, the night continues, and the stars continue, and the air continues to be warm and salt and full of the particular quality of open water far from land. The story has sunk, but you have not. You are still here, on the surface, in the warmth, in the quiet that follows the end of something. And the night around you carries no danger. The explosion has happened in the past in the story, and what remains is only the after, the still water, the dark sky, the sense of something having been present and now being absent. Rest in that after. It is a peaceful place, as all endings are in the fullness of their completion. To understand why the Ourang Medan story exists, you have to understand the world it was born into. 1947 is not a year that announces itself with the clarity of, say, 1945 with its single overwhelming historical event. 1947 is a year of aftermath and transition, a year in which the consequences of the war were still being sorted, in which the political map of Asia was still being redrawn, in which the certainties that colonial powers had assumed for generations were revealing themselves to be far less certain than anyone had admitted. It was a year of in-between. The war was done, but the peace was not yet made. The empires were intact, but the peoples inside them were not willing to remain that way. The world knew what it had been and did not yet know what it would become. The Netherlands East Indies, the vast archipelago that would become Indonesia, was in the middle of a struggle for independence that the Dutch were reluctant to acknowledge as inevitable. The Netherlands, newly liberated from German occupation, was in no mood to accept the further diminishment of its global position that Indonesian independence would represent. The result was a colonial war, euphemistically described as a police action, that would last until 1949 and would end with Indonesian independence only under sustained international pressure. In 1947, the Dutch military was actively engaged in this conflict, and the shipping lanes of the strait were carrying the material of war alongside the material of trade. Sumatra, whose northeastern coast includes the city of Medan, was at the centre of this struggle. The city of Medan was a Dutch colonial creation, built around the tobacco plantations of the interior, a place of considerable wealth and the particular social rigidity that plantation economies tend to produce. It was also a place that the independence movement had reached, that the Japanese occupation had changed, that the post-war years had left in a state of uncertain allegiance and uncertain governance. A ship named for the people of Medan, or for a man from Medan, in the more literal translation, was a ship with a particular cultural resonance in this context. It was a ship that carried its location in its name, and that location was a place in transition. Into this world came an enormous quantity of material that needed to move invisibly. The Japanese occupation of Southeast Asia had lasted more than 3 years, and had left behind warehouses of weapons, stores of materials appropriated from occupied territories, the practical residue of a military empire that had ended abruptly. Allied military forces had captured enormous quantities of Japanese material, arms, ammunition, chemical and biological warfare materials that the Japanese had developed and used in China and elsewhere, and the disposition of this material was a practical and political problem of the first order. Some of it was destroyed in place, some of it was shipped to official disposal sites, some of it moved through less official channels. The less official channels were operated by people who understood the commercial value of surplus military materials in a world where governments were demobilizing millions of men and industries were converting from war production to peacetime goods. Weapons and ammunition and chemical compounds had buyers in independence movements, buyers in the criminal economies that expanded rapidly in the war's aftermath, buyers in the intelligence agencies of nations that were already jockeying for position in the world that was emerging from the wreckage. The post-war period was also the beginning of what would become the Cold War, and in that developing geopolitical framework, certain types of cargo had value that could not be declared in a manifest. Intelligence services of multiple nations were operating in Southeast Asia, cultivating relationships with independence movements and colonial administrations alike, moving money and weapons and personnel in ways that did not appear in any official record. The Strait, in this context, was not merely a commercial shipping lane but a passage through a region of intense and overlapping intelligence activity. A ship carrying classified materials in this environment would have operated under conditions of secrecy that might make its documentation impossible to locate decades later. If the Ourang Medan existed and carried something that powerful organizations needed kept invisible, those organizations had both the motive and the capability to ensure that the documentation trail was incomplete or non-existent. The absence of a registration record, of a manifest, of a company record, is not conclusive evidence that no such ship existed. It may simply be evidence that the ship existed in a world where certain things were not recorded. The timing of the story's first public appearance is itself worth noting. The incident is supposed to have occurred in 1947, or perhaps 1948. The story first appears in print in a German maritime publication in 1952, and from there circulates to an English-language publication, and from there into the broader literature of maritime mystery. By 1952, the story had had 5 years to develop in oral form, to be told by the sailors who claimed to have received the distress call or to have boarded the vessel, to be refined in the telling into the version that made it into print. 5 years is enough time for a true story to acquire the details it initially lacked, and enough time for a false story to acquire the details that make it feel true. The story of the Ourang Medan appealed to something specific in the post-war imagination. It was a story about a world that was not safe, about threats that were invisible, about death that came without warning and without explanation, about the uncanny persistence of the war's violence into the peacetime world. It was a story for people who had lived through 6 years of total war and now found themselves in a world that was supposed to be peaceful, but that retained, underneath the resumption of ordinary life, all the anxiety of a world that had nearly ended. The peace did not feel secure. The chemicals that had been deployed during the war had not disappeared. The weapons of mass destruction that had been developed and used were still in the world, and the world had not yet found a satisfactory way to live with them. Mysteries of this type, maritime horror, inexplicable mass death, a ship that sinks before it can be examined, tap into something deep in the human relationship with the sea. The sea has always been the place where things disappear, where the rules of the land do not apply, where the ordinary frameworks of cause and effect become unreliable. A story about a ship where everyone died for reasons that cannot be determined is a story about the sea itself, about the fundamental unpredictability of a world that is mostly water. You are in this world now, the world that made the story possible, the warm night of the post-war strait, the shipping lanes carrying their mixture of ordinary commerce and extraordinary secrecy, the air above the water carrying radio transmissions that sometimes said things that no one expected to hear. The world is not dangerous here, in this telling, in this hour. It is simply large and old and full of things that were never fully known. That world is past now. It is history, and history is quiet. The wars that gave rise to the story have been fought and settled and recorded and examined from every angle that historians have been able to find. The independence movements that were in progress when the Ourang Medan is supposed to have sailed have achieved their independence. The colonial empires that controlled the strait have dissolved. The Cold War that was just beginning when the story entered circulation has ended. All of this has happened, and all of it is quiet now, and its quietness is something you can carry with you into sleep. The world that produced the Ourang Medan also produced you at many removes. The post-war world, the decolonizing world, the world of rebuilt cities and demobilized soldiers and industries converting back from destruction to creation. That world made the one that followed, and the one after that, and eventually the world that contains you now, in this moment, in this quiet. You come from that world. All of us do. And the story it told about a ship in the strait is a story that belongs to all of us, in the same way. Thank you so much for watching. If you would like to see more videos like this, please consider leaving a like and subscribing to the channel, as it really helps us continue making more content. If you are drifting now, let yourself go. Subscribe so the next story is waiting when you return. Sleep well. Every legend eventually attracts people who want to find the evidence underneath it. The Ourang Medan has attracted its share of investigators over the decades since the story first circulated. Some have approached it as believers, looking for evidence that confirms the incident occurred as described. Others have approached it as skeptics, looking for the gaps and inconsistencies that would allow the legend to be definitively placed in the category of fiction. Most have ended up somewhere between these positions, which is perhaps the most honest place to be with a story that resists final resolution as stubbornly as this one does. The most thorough examination of the Ourang Medan story in terms of its documentation has consistently found the same absence. There is no record in Lloyd's Registry, the comprehensive record of British and international shipping that has been maintained since the 17th century, of a vessel by that name. There is no record in Dutch maritime archives of a registered freighter with that name in the relevant years. There is no record in the port registries of the region's major ports, Penang, Singapore, Batavia, Medan itself, of a vessel of that name arriving or departing in the late 1940s. The absence of records is a fact. What the absence means is the question. A genuine ship that was deliberately kept off official records might show no documentation traces. A genuine ship that sank quickly and completely, in an era before comprehensive electronic record-keeping, might leave minimal traces in archives that were themselves incomplete and partially destroyed by wartime and colonial transition. A fictional ship invented by a storyteller or a journalist would also show no documentation traces. The absence of records is consistent with all three possibilities and definitively supportive of none of them. One of the most interesting investigations was conducted by a researcher named Roy Bainton, a British maritime historian who spent several years working on the Ourang Medan story, and whose conclusions were published in a maritime history journal in 2004. Bainton was unable to find documentary evidence confirming the ship's existence, but he was also unable to find evidence that definitively disproved it. What he found instead was the story's origins in a German maritime publication of the early 1950s, and the chain of transmission that carried it from that publication into the broader maritime literature. The German publication, it was associated with the German Merchant Marine Officers Association, carried the story in multiple installments in 1952 and 1953. The story was presented as factual, as an account of an actual incident that had occurred in the late 1940s. The source for the story was not clearly identified. The researcher who had assembled the account is not named in a way that allows subsequent verification. This is itself a notable absence. A story presented as journalism without a clearly identified journalist is a story whose provenance is already uncertain. From the German Maritime publication, the story passed to an English-language publication for sea captains, which ran a translated and condensed version in the mid-1950s. From there, it passed into the general circulation of maritime lore, picked up by writers on unexplained phenomena, by encyclopedias of maritime mystery, by the various publications that collected strange and inexplicable stories from the sea. Each retelling added or emphasized or occasionally subtracted details, but the core elements remained constant. The distress call, the boarding, the dead, the expressions, the explosion, the sinking. The consistency of the core elements across many retellings is itself ambiguous evidence. On one hand, it suggests that the story was being carefully transmitted, that the essential facts were being preserved because they were facts. On the other hand, it might simply reflect the story's internal logic. The core elements reinforce each other so effectively that they tend to be retained even by tellers who might otherwise embellish freely. The dead men and their expressions, the boarding party and their survival, the explosion and the sinking, these elements form a self-consistent narrative that is difficult to simplify without losing essential dramatic tension. The investigators who have approached the Ourang Medan from a paranormal perspective have, predictably, found different things than those who approached it from a purely documentary standpoint. For investigators drawn to the possibility of supernatural explanations, the story fits into a pattern: ships that encounter unexplained atmospheric phenomena, vessels that enter zones of electromagnetic anomaly, crew members who experience inexplicable mass death without conventional cause, the cold bodies, the expressions of terror, the rapid explosion. In this framework, these are not anomalies to be explained by chemistry or mechanical failure, but evidence of something that exists outside the ordinary categories of physical cause and effect. The paranormal investigations produce some of the most colourful interpretations of the story. UFO researchers suggested that the Ourang Medan had encountered a craft of extraterrestrial origin, that the crew had been killed by some form of radiation or energy weapon deployed by non-human visitors. Spiritualists suggested that the ship had passed through a zone of intense negative psychic energy, a place where some ancient violence had left an indelible mark on the fabric of space. Writers on ancient mysteries connected the story to Atlantean power sources, to ley lines that crossed the strait, to the accumulated energy of thousands of years of human passage through these waters. These interpretations are entertaining in their own way, and they reveal something about the categories the human imagination reaches for when the ordinary explanations fail. When science cannot account for something, mythology moves into the space that science leaves. The Ourang Medan became, for certain communities of the curious and the credulous, an example of the extraordinary that science refused to acknowledge, a story that the mainstream refused to investigate seriously, because the investigation would lead to conclusions that the mainstream was not prepared to accept. More sober investigators pointed out repeatedly that the mainstream refused to investigate seriously, not because the conclusions were uncomfortable, but because the story lacked the documentation that serious investigation requires. You cannot conduct a proper forensic examination of an incident for which you cannot establish that the incident occurred. You cannot analyze the cause of death when you cannot confirm that the deaths happened. The story is not refused on the grounds of its conclusions, but on the grounds of its evidence, or the absence of it. What all the investigators share, across their different approaches and their different conclusions, is the experience of encountering the story's essential resistance. The Ourang Medan does not yield to investigation. It does not provide the confirming detail that would establish it as fact, and it does not provide the disconfirming detail that would establish it as fiction. It sits in the gap between those categories and refuses to move toward either of them. This resistance is itself what has kept investigators returning to it across more than 70 years. You have been among the investigators now, in a sense, moving through the archive of this story's reception. The archive is quiet, the way archives always are, full of the absence of things that should be there, full of the presence of things that resist simple interpretation. You have been in the archive and you are coming out of it now, into the story itself again, into the ship and the strait and the dark night that holds them both. What you carry from the archive is not resolution but something softer. The understanding that a story which has lasted this long, which has attracted this much attention, which has resisted this much investigation and this much debunking, has earned its place in the world, whether it is true or not, whether it happened or not, it is real in the way that all enduring stories are real. Real in its effects, real in what it tells us about the people who told it and the world they were living in. And that reality is available to you, here, in this quiet hour. The sea has its own chemistry, its own physics, its own capacity for producing events that look, from the outside, like deliberate acts. Before reaching for explanations that require secret cargoes or unknown forces, it is worth spending time with what the ocean itself is capable of. The Strait of Malacca is not a simple body of water. It sits above a complex geology, in a region of significant tectonic activity, on the margins of the Sunda Plate, in waters that have been shaped by the same forces that produced the Indonesian archipelago, one of the most volcanically and seismically active regions on the planet. The floor of the strait is not uniform. It contains ridges and valleys, areas of sediment accumulation and areas of bedrock exposure, and in some places, areas where geological processes are ongoing, in ways that affect the water column above them. One of the most interesting natural explanations for the Ourang Medan incident involves a phenomenon called a methane clathrate eruption, or sometimes a seafloor methane release. Methane clathrates are compounds in which methane, natural gas, is trapped in a crystalline structure of water molecules at low temperature and high pressure, typically in the deep sediments of the ocean floor. Under certain conditions, these clathrate deposits can destabilize rapidly, releasing large quantities of methane gas into the water column and thence into the atmosphere above. A large methane release from the seafloor could, in theory, create conditions at the sea surface that would be dangerous to anyone on a vessel directly above the release site. The methane displaces oxygen in the air, creating pockets of gas-enriched atmosphere that are invisible and nearly odorless at lower concentrations. A ship that passed over an active methane release site could find itself in an atmosphere that was suddenly and significantly depleted of oxygen over a specific area of the sea. The crew would lose consciousness quickly, methane asphyxiation, without the warning of smell or taste that other gases provide, and die before any effective response was possible. The methane theory also offers an explanation for some of the more unusual details in the accounts. Methane at certain concentrations has a slight anesthetic effect, and the muscular contractions that appear to have affected the bodies of the Ourang Medan's crew, the frozen expressions, the extended arms, could be consistent with asphyxiation of a type that produces muscular rigidity as part of its mechanism. The cold bodies could be explained by the fact that a large methane release would produce a significant temperature drop in the immediate area as the gas expands and absorbs heat from its surroundings. This is basic thermodynamics. Expanding gas cools. A large, rapid methane release into a confined space above a ship could produce a transient cold zone that would affect the bodies of anyone inside it. The explosion that sank the Ourang Medan would also be consistent with a methane release. Methane is highly flammable, and a concentration of methane gas sufficient to kill the crew would also be sufficient if ignited to produce an explosion. The source of ignition could have been as ordinary as a spark from the ship's electrical system, or the firing of a boiler, or any number of the mundane ignition sources present on a working cargo vessel. The fire and explosion described in the accounts of the sinking would follow naturally from the ignition of accumulated methane gas. This theory has the appeal of not requiring any secret cargo, any deliberate deception, any intervention by powerful organizations that need to be imagined or inferred. It requires only the ordinary geological processes of a tectonically active region, and the bad fortune of a ship that happened to be in the wrong place at a moment of seafloor instability. It is, in the vocabulary of explanation, parsimonious. It accounts for the observed effects with the minimum number of assumed causes, and it has the additional merit of not requiring that we assume the documentation was suppressed, since a natural event of this type would not necessarily attract the kind of official attention that produces records. There are problems with the methane theory, as with all the theories. A methane release sufficient to kill an entire ship's crew would likely be detectable across a wide area. Other vessels in the vicinity, if any were present, might have noticed unusual effects. The rescue vessel that received the distress call and proceeded to the coordinates would have moved through waters potentially still affected by the release. If the methane was still present in dangerous concentrations when the boarding party arrived, they would have been at risk. If it had dissipated, the question of how quickly it dispersed in the open tropical air becomes relevant to the credibility of the account. Another natural explanation less dramatic than the methane theory, but perhaps more plausible in ordinary terms, involves the ship's cargo being something genuinely dangerous, but not exotic. Poorly stored organic cargo generating toxic gases, improperly sealed chemical fertilizers, cargo that was mislabeled or mishandled, and that combined with the heat of the tropics, in ways that produced a lethal atmosphere in the holds, and, eventually, the inhabited spaces of the ship. Ships carrying organic cargo in the tropics have historically experienced exactly this kind of incident. Rotting cargo generates carbon dioxide and methane, and in some cases hydrogen sulfide, a gas with a characteristic smell of rotten eggs that is also extremely toxic. A hold full of rotting cargo generating hydrogen sulfide could, under certain circumstances, allow enough gas to accumulate in the ship's interior spaces to be lethal. The speed of the deaths would depend on the concentration of the gas. High concentrations of hydrogen sulfide produce almost instantaneous loss of consciousness and death. The person is not aware of dying in the way that a person dying of disease is aware. One moment they are breathing, and the next moment they are not. Hydrogen sulfide also produces effects on the body that are consistent with some of the details in the accounts. It paralyzes the respiratory muscles, which can produce the kind of fixed, rigid posture described in the accounts of the Ourang Medan's dead. It is denser than air, which means it settles in lower spaces first, explaining perhaps why the crew in the engine room and the lower holds might have been the first to be incapacitated, while the officers on the bridge or in the chart room were exposed somewhat later. And hydrogen sulfide is reactive with ignition sources. A ship full of accumulated hydrogen sulfide gas, with a spark from electrical systems or a flame in the engine room, would produce exactly the fire and explosion described in the accounts. The gas would have dissipated enough by the time the boarding party arrived that they were not immediately affected, but enough remained in the holds or in the ship's atmosphere to ignite when the conditions were right. These natural explanations are not satisfying in the way that a solved mystery is satisfying. They do not produce the closure of a clear cause confirmed by clear evidence. They offer instead the more modest satisfaction of plausibility, of knowing that the world contains mechanisms that could produce what was described without requiring anything beyond the ordinary capabilities of matter and chemistry, and the unfortunate intersection of a ship and a dangerous atmospheric event. The sea does not need our theories to have done what it may have done. Whatever happened on the Ourang Medan, if anything happened in a moment that is now 70-odd years past, in water that has received a great many things since, under a sky that has continued its patient work regardless. The theories are for us, not for the sea. The sea has already moved on. And you can move on too, for now, into the next stretch of the story, where the night deepens and the questions become, if anything, more beautifully unanswerable. The world below the surface of the strait is its own kind of dark, its own kind of quiet, and you are above it, resting, held up by the ordinary buoyancy of the surface, breathing the warm air of a night that has no danger in it. Rest on that surface a little longer. The story continues below. The Ourang Medan was not the first ship to become a mystery. The sea has been producing mysteries since the first time a vessel went out of sight of land and did not return. The record of maritime history is partly a record of absences, ships that left port and arrived nowhere, vessels whose last known position is noted in a log somewhere and whose subsequent fate is unknown, seafarers whose families waited and eventually stopped waiting. Most of these absences have explanations that are prosaic if terrible: storm, reef, fire, structural failure, collision in the dark. The sea is a demanding environment, and it makes its demands without sentiment. But some ships produce mysteries that resist explanation, that leave enough behind to suggest a story without providing enough to tell it. These vessels become, in the maritime imagination, a special category. The ghost ship, the death ship, the vessel that carries its mystery-like cargo, that has become more famous for what it cannot explain than for anything it accomplished in its working life. These ships are real even when their stories are not fully real. They occupy space in the maritime literature that is different from the space occupied by merely famous ships. They are not celebrated. They are haunted. The Mary Celeste is the most famous of these vessels, and its story is worth setting beside the Ourang Medan's, not because the two incidents resemble each other closely, but because the Mary Celeste established the template for a certain kind of maritime mystery, and understanding the template helps illuminate what the Ourang Medan story is doing with it. The Mary Celeste was found in the Atlantic in December 1872, drifting without crew. She had left New York 10 days earlier under the command of a Captain Briggs, carrying a cargo of commercial alcohol and a crew of 7, plus the captain's wife and 2-year-old daughter. When she was found by the crew of the Dei Gracia, a Canadian brigantine, the Mary Celeste was seaworthy. Her sails were set although improperly for the conditions, and there was food and water aboard, clothing and valuables left in the cabins. No sign of violence, no sign of fire, no sign of the kind of catastrophic structural event that would explain why everyone had abandoned ship. The lifeboat was missing. The crew, 10 people including the captain, his wife and child, were never found. No body was ever recovered. No explanation was ever established with certainty. The Mary Celeste's mystery has generated more theories than almost any other maritime incident. Seaquakes that momentarily flooded the hold with water that quickly drained, water spouts that terrified the crew into the lifeboat, the alcohol cargo generating explosive vapours that frightened the captain into ordering an evacuation, pirates who for some reason left the ship intact. None of the theories has been definitively established. The mystery has persisted for more than 150 years because the evidence is simultaneously suggestive and inconclusive, enough to generate theories, insufficient to confirm any of them. The Caroline Deering is another vessel in this tradition. Found aground on Cape Hatteras in January 1921, the 5-masted commercial schooner was intact, with food being prepared in the galley, with the crew's personal effects in their quarters, with no sign of the kind of emergency that would ordinarily produce a hasty departure, and with no crew. All 11 members of the crew were gone. The lifeboats were missing, but the ship's anchors had been deployed, suggesting the crew had tried to stop the ship at some point. No explanation was ever established. The incident was investigated by the State Department of the United States, which sent letters to 5 other governments attempting to gather information. The letters produced nothing useful. The investigation concluded without identifying a cause or a responsible party. The Caroline Deering joined the category of maritime mysteries that cannot be resolved with available evidence, and it has remained there ever since. These vessels share certain features with the Ourang Medan, and those shared features are worth attending to. In each case, the mystery pivots on an absence, not on what is found, but on what is missing. The Mary Celeste is missing its crew and its lifeboat. The Deering is missing its crew and its lifeboats. The Ourang Medan is missing its explanations. The crew are present, but the cause of their deaths is absent. In each case, the vessel itself is found intact enough to have continued its voyage, or close to it. The problem is entirely with the humans, or the human understanding of what happened to them. This is a pattern that reveals something about the maritime imagination. The sea is supposed to be the danger, and the ship is supposed to be the protection. A story about a ship that is destroyed, that sinks, that burns, that breaks apart on a reef, confirms our understanding of the sea's power and the ship's vulnerability. But a story about a ship that is perfectly fine while its crew are dead or missing violates a deeper expectation, the expectation that the vessel will reflect the fate of those aboard it, that the ship will carry evidence of what happened, that the scene will be readable. When the scene is not readable, when the ship is intact and the crew are gone, or when the ship is intact and the crew are dead in poses that have no ordinary explanation, something in the maritime imagination becomes unsettled in a way that goes beyond ordinary fear. It is not the fear of drowning or of storm. It is something older, something to do with the uncanny, with the sense that the ordinary rules of cause and effect have been suspended. The sea, in these stories, is not simply a physical environment. It is a space where the ordinary relationship between events and their evidence breaks down, where things happen that leave insufficient traces for explanation. The Ourang Medan feeds this specific unsettlement. If the crew had been found drowned, or burned, or killed by visible violence, the story would be sad but comprehensible. What makes it persist is the combination of intact ship, dead crew, inexplicable expressions, and the additional layer of the explosion that removed all possibility of further investigation. The story presents itself as evidence of something inexplicable, and then removes the evidence before it can be examined. You have been on these ships in your imagination, these vessels of the maritime literature of mystery. The Mary Celeste, the Deering, the Ourang Medan, each one occupying its own particular corner of the human need to name the things the sea does not explain. You carry them lightly, as all these stories should be carried, as companions in the dark, as evidence that the world is larger than what we can account for, as reminders that the ocean has always known things that those of us on land have had to accept, without documentation, without final verification. There is a particular quality to the experience of sitting with a mystery that has no resolution. It is not the frustrated quality of a puzzle that cannot be solved. It is something more like the quality of sitting with a piece of music that does not resolve its final chord, a suspended tension that is not unpleasant, that has its own kind of beauty, that makes you aware of what resolution would feel like by deferring it indefinitely. The Ourang Medan has this quality. It keeps the question open, and an open question, late at night in the dark, is its own kind of companion. The night around you now carries no danger. The stories of the ghost ships are old and quiet and resolved. In their way, not solved, but resolved, deposited in the archive of the things the world contains that we do not fully understand. They rest there comfortably, and you can rest alongside them in the particular peace of having held a mystery and not been diminished by it. Somewhere in the story is a man. He is easy to lose in the accumulation of theories and investigations, in the arguments about chemical cargo and methane releases and documentary evidence, in the broader pattern of ghost ship stories and maritime mythology. But at the centre of the story, if the story is true, is a specific human being, a radio operator almost certainly, since the distress call was sent in Morse code, and sending Morse required training that only certain crew members would have had, who survived whatever killed his colleagues long enough to reach the radio room and transmit what he knew. Think about what that survival required. If the incident occurred as described, then whatever came for the crew of the Ourang Medan came quickly and completely. The officers in the chart room and on the bridge were dead, the crew in the engine room were dead, the dog was dead, and yet one person was alive enough to move to the radio room, to compose a message, to key the transmission, to describe in the fewest possible words what had happened and what was happening to them. Whether this person survived by chance, by position, by the particular luck of being in a space that offered some degree of protection from whatever was killing everyone else, we cannot know. But they survived long enough. The radio operator of the Ourang Medan, if such a person existed, was doing something extraordinarily deliberate in the midst of dying. He was choosing words. He was choosing the words that would most efficiently convey the situation to whoever might be listening on the frequencies he was transmitting on. All officers, including captain, are dead, lying in chart room and bridge. This is not a cry of anguish. It is a report. It describes the situation with the economy of someone who has very little time and knows it, who is working with the discipline of a professional in the extremity of the moment. The phrasing of the transmission suggests a mind still functioning at professional capacity even as the body was failing. The information is sequenced correctly. Ship identification, situation description, location of the dead, status of the crew. These are the elements of a distress call, arranged in the order that would allow a receiving vessel to act on them most quickly. The radio operator, in the midst of whatever was happening to them, was thinking about the people who would receive the message and what those people would need to know. This is a particular kind of professional devotion, the instinct to serve the purpose of one's role, even when the role has been overtaken by circumstances that make ordinary professional duty seem irrelevant. Then the pause, and then the two final words. I die. These words have attracted the most attention of any element in the story, precisely because they are so simple and so complete. They do not say I am dying, the progressive tense that would suggest a process still underway. They say I die, a present tense that is also, grammatically, the tense of general statements, of universal truths. The sun rises, the tide goes out, I die. The compression of the phrase makes it feel like a declaration of something inevitable and accepted, something that has crossed over from the personal into the general, from the individual experience into the universal condition. In another reading, the phrase is simply the product of someone transmitting in a language that was not their first. The Ourang Medan was a Dutch-registered vessel, and its crew were most likely Dutch, Indonesian, or a mixture of both. A Dutch radio operator transmitting in English, the international language of maritime communication, might produce exactly this grammatical form. a literal translation of the Dutch Ik sterf, or perhaps something closer to a simpler form, compressed by the effort of translation in extremity. The grammar is not proof of anything except that someone was transmitting in their second or third language in the final moments of their life. Or the two words were a final act of deliberate communication, chosen because they were the truest possible description of what was happening, and because the person transmitting them had enough professional pride to send a final message that was useful rather than emotional. The distress call had already accomplished its practical purpose. It had named the ship, identified the situation, provided coordinates that could be used to locate the vessel. The two final words served a different purpose. They confirmed that the sender was still alive at the time of sending, and that they would not be alive much longer, and that whoever received the message should not expect further transmissions. There is also the question of why one person survived when everyone else died. If the cause of death was a gas or chemical agent, the radio operator's survival might reflect their location on the ship, a room with slightly better ventilation, or above the level where the gas accumulated, or simply a few additional seconds of life that allowed them to get a message out before the concentration reached lethal levels. If the cause was something else, mechanical, physiological, environmental, the survivor's position might have been the result of chance, of being in a different part of the ship at the moment the incident occurred. Or the survivor survived for longer, not by luck or position, but by some quality of individual physiological response. People vary considerably in their response to chemical agents and to oxygen deprivation. What kills one person in 30 seconds may take 3 minutes to kill another. A person with a lower baseline metabolic rate, or with some other physiological difference, might have been the last to succumb and might have retained enough function in those final minutes to reach the radio room and transmit. The radio room of a cargo freighter in the 1940s was a specific physical space. It contained the transmitter and receiver, the reference books for frequencies and codes, the log in which all transmissions were recorded, the clock, and the instruments that allowed precise timing of transmissions. It was a functional space designed for work, and a radio operator entering it in normal circumstances would have found it entirely familiar. The smell of electronics, the sound of the receiver's background static, the particular feel of the transmitter key. In the circumstances the radio operator of the Ourang Medan entered it, the familiarity of the space must have been both reassuring and terrible. Reassuring because it was his workspace, the place he knew, the place where his training prepared him to function. Terrible because the function his training prepared him for, communication, the sending and receiving of messages that maintained the ship's connection to the world beyond itself, was about to be used for the last possible message, the message that ends all further messages. There is something very human about this, something that speaks to the way people reach for the familiar and the professional in moments of extreme stress. The radio operator did not do something heroic and unprecedented. They did the thing they knew how to do, the thing their training had prepared them for, in the most difficult possible version of the circumstances that training was meant to address. They sent a message. They reported what they knew. They said, "I die," and they died. Sleep is like that too, in its way. Not the dying, but the yielding. The reaching for the familiar rhythm of the body's own descent. The breath that carries you down into the dark of the night's interior, into the place where the professional mind finally releases its hold on the day's requirements and the body takes over. The radio operator sent his message and let go. You can send yours, whatever it is, whatever the day's final communication might be, and let go too. There is a version of the Ourang Medan story in which the ship never existed. Not in the sense of a deliberate fabrication by a named person with an identifiable motive, though that is possible, but in the broader sense that stories sometimes arise from the aggregation of real events, rumours, partial truths, and the imagination's tendency to make narrative out of the raw material it has available. A story without a single author, assembled over time from multiple sources, none of which individually contains the full story, but which together produce something that has the coherence and specificity of an event that happened. The process by which this happens is not mysterious. It is, in fact, the ordinary process by which maritime legend is created. Something real occurs, a ship in distress, a crew that died, a vessel that sank under unclear circumstances. The people who witnessed it or heard about it tell the story to others. In the telling, the story is simplified, made more vivid, stripped of ambiguity and uncertainty in favour of the clear detail that makes a narrative easy to pass on. Over time, the telling incorporates elements from other stories, from the general vocabulary of maritime horror that listeners already carry, from the needs of each teller's audience for the story to be satisfying in whatever way they need it to be satisfying. In this version of the Ourang Medan's origins, there may have been a real incident, a ship that sent a distress call and was found with dead crew, perhaps in the waters of Southeast Asia in the late 1940s, perhaps with cargo that was not what its manifest described, perhaps with a cause of death that could not be cleanly established. This real incident was heard about by someone who wrote it down, or told it to someone who wrote it down, or was reconstructed from fragmentary accounts by someone who was writing about maritime mysteries. The name Ourang Medan was attached, and the core elements were established, and the story entered circulation. Once in circulation, the story did what stories do. It was retold by people who had heard it from people who had heard it. Each retelling added specificity, the exact phrasing of the distress call, the detail of the dog, the description of the faces of the dead, the precise sequence of fire and explosion and sinking. These details were not necessarily invented with any intention to deceive. They were the details that the story, in its retelling, developed naturally, the way any story develops the concrete specificity that makes it feel true even when it cannot be verified. The researcher Roy Bainton, who conducted one of the most thorough examinations of the Ourang Medan's documentary record, concluded that the incident may have been based on a real event, but that the details as circulated cannot be verified and may have been significantly elaborated. This is a careful and honest conclusion, and it is worth holding on to as you continue through the story. It does not say the incident did not happen. It says the incident as described cannot be verified, which is a different thing. The unverifiability of a story is not the same as its falsity. It is the condition of many things that happened without leaving adequate documentation. The distinction matters because it preserves the possibility of something real underneath the legend, while acknowledging that the legend has overgrown whatever real event may have been its seed. Many of the great maritime mysteries have this character. The Mary Celeste was a real ship and a real disappearance, but the details that made it famous, the half-eaten breakfasts and the ship's cat sitting calmly amid the mystery, were additions by a fiction writer who wrote a story inspired by the real incident, and whose fictional details were subsequently reported as facts. The real event is submerged beneath the accretion of telling. It still exists beneath the legend, but it is not accessible in its original form. What would the real event have to have been if the Ourang Medan legend is rooted in something true? It would not need to have been as dramatic as the legend. A ship that experienced a gas-related incident, killing some of the crew and incapacitating the rest, that sent a distress call and was found by a passing vessel, and that subsequently caught fire and sank. This is not an impossible scenario for the post-war Strait. The mystery might have been simpler than the legend, the cause more explicable, the documentation less complete than standard not because of deliberate suppression, but because the incident occurred in a region and era where record-keeping was imperfect. But the legend took hold, and the legend is what we have. The legend is more interesting than the probable reality, because the legend stripped away the prosaic explanations and retained only the elements that resist explanation. This is what legends do. They are the distillation of the inexplicable in an event, the part that could not be filed away under a heading that made it comprehensible. The Ourang Medan legend is what was left after the explicable parts of the real incident, if there was a real incident, were discarded as insufficiently mysterious. Living with a story that cannot be verified is a particular kind of experience. It asks something different of you than living with a story that has documentation, that has a clear cause and a known sequence of events, and a resolution that can be checked against the record. An unverifiable story asks you to be present with the uncertainty, to resist the impulse to resolve it prematurely in one direction or another, to accept that the question and the story can exist together without the question having to be answered before the story can be valued. This is, in its way, a description of how to be with mystery in general, not only with the Ourang Medan, but with the broader category of things that happened and cannot be fully known, things that were real in some sense but that left evidence too fragmentary to build a complete account, things that exist in the space between documented history and unrecoverable past. The Ourang Medan is simply a particularly vivid example of what is, in fact, the condition of most of the past, imperfectly known, partially documented, dependent on stories that may or may not faithfully represent events that may or may not have occurred as described. The ship may not have existed. The ship, if it existed, may not have done what the story says it did. The story, regardless of what the ship did or did not do, has existed now for over 70 years, and in that existence has told something true about the world that produced it, about the anxieties of the post-war era, about the human relationship with the sea, about the maritime imagination and its particular fears and fascinations. That truth does not require the ship to have been real. What this means for you, here in the quiet of this night, is that the story you've been inhabiting is real in its own way. You have moved through it with attention and with willingness to be in the uncertainty of it. That movement is real. The questions you have carried through it are real. The way the story has settled around you as the night has deepened is real. All of this is real regardless of whether the Ourang Medan was real. The ship may not have existed, and the story, which is what you have, exists completely. That is enough. More than enough, actually. The story and the night and the quiet are all you need. And the story continues. Whatever the ship was, it is still ahead of you in the telling. The water is still dark. The night is still full of questions that are too beautiful, in their way, to require answers. Before the mystery, there was the ordinary life. A cargo freighter of the late 1940s was a particular kind of world, self-contained, hierarchical, bound by routines so established they had the quality of ritual, moved by engines that were tended with the focused attention that any complex and essential machinery requires. The men who crewed these vessels lived in close quarters for weeks at a time, in spaces that were functional rather than comfortable. In the company of men they might not have chosen as companions on land, but who became, through the intimacy of shared work and shared risk, a community of a kind that land life rarely produces. The routine of a cargo vessel is one of the most complete routines that human life has produced. It governs everything: when you sleep, when you eat, when you work, when you have free time, who gives you orders and who receives yours. On land, the day has its structure, but the structure is permeable, interrupted by the random encounters and the personal choices that define life in a social world. At sea, the structure is nearly total. The routine is the ship's operating system, the thing that allows a collection of individual men to function as a single mechanism, capable of moving tens of thousands of tons of cargo across thousands of miles of open ocean without coming apart. A Dutch freighter in the late 1940s would have carried a crew of perhaps 30 to 40 men, depending on its size. The officers, captain, first officer, second officer, third officer, occupied a social world somewhat separate from the able-bodied seamen and the engine room workers, eating separately, sleeping in slightly better quarters, exercising the authority that the hierarchy of a working ship requires. The radio operator occupied a particular position, technically part of the officer class, but a specialist whose duties were distinct from navigation and seamanship, a person defined by a skill that set them apart from both the officers proper and the ordinary crew. The radio operator existed at the node between the ship and the world beyond it. The daily rhythm of a cargo freighter at sea had a predictability that was, for the men who lived it, both tedious and reassuring. Watches were kept on a 4 hours on, 8 hours off rotation that organised the day into a series of shifts, each with its responsibilities and its endpoint. The engine room required constant attention. The boilers or diesels that drove the ship needed monitoring, maintenance, the endless small adjustments that kept them running within their designed parameters. The deck crew had their own routines: painting, splicing lines, checking and maintaining the cargo lashings, attending to the 100 small deteriorations that salt air and constant motion produce in any mechanical system. The officers stood their watches on the bridge, navigating by the stars when the sky was clear, by dead reckoning and by the instruments when it was not, maintaining the log that recorded position and speed and course, and weather at regular intervals. The log was the ship's continuous autobiography, the record that placed it in space and time. If the Ourang Medan's log survived the explosion and sinking, it would be at the bottom of the strait, unreadable now, but once a careful and complete record of the ship's last voyage. Every course change, every weather observation, every position fix, the steady accumulation of a ship's passage through the world. The cook, who occupied a position of considerable importance on any vessel, would have been preparing food in the galley at intervals throughout the day. The smell of cooking was one of the constants of life on a working ship, along with the smell of the engine oil that permeated the engineering spaces, the salt air that was ever present on deck, the particular smell of the cargo hold that varied with what the ship was carrying. A freighter's interior has a dozen distinct atmospheres, each associated with a function, each recognizable to anyone who has spent time aboard. In the hours before whatever happened, the Ourang Medan would have had the smell of a ship going about its business. The galley smells, the engine room smells, the salt air on the open deck, the sound of the engines that penetrated every corner of the vessel, a constant deep vibration that you stop noticing after the first few days because the human nervous system adapts to constant sensation by removing it from conscious attention. The sound of water against the hull, different at different speeds and in different sea states, a sound that experienced sailors can interpret without thinking. What would the crew of the Ourang Medan have been thinking about in the hours before whatever happened? The ordinary concerns of men at sea, when they would arrive at the next port, what the port offered in terms of rest and recreation, whether the letters from home that had been waiting for them in the last port had contained good news or difficult news. The concerns of men working in the post-war world, the cost of things, the political situation in the Netherlands and in the Indies, the way the world they had returned to after the war years was both familiar and different in ways that were hard to articulate. Some of them would have had families, children they had not seen for months, wives or partners to whom they had written from the last port and from whom they would receive letters at the next. The particular loneliness of the seafarer is not the loneliness of isolation, but the loneliness of absence, being away from the life you are connected to, knowing that life is continuing without you, trusting that the connections will hold across the distance and the time. The children grow, the seasons change, the life at home proceeds at its ordinary pace, while the life at sea proceeds at its own entirely different pace, and the gap between them is one of the defining experiences of a seafarer's existence. The radio operator had a special relationship with that loneliness. Their skill allowed them to maintain a connection to the world beyond the ship in a way that other crew members could not. They could receive news broadcasts, weather forecasts, the traffic of other ships on the frequencies they monitored. They were the ship's ear turned toward the world, the person through whom all information from outside arrived and through whom all messages to the outside were sent. In the version of the story where the radio operator lived long enough to send the distress call, they were performing this function one last time. The crew of the Ourang Medan, whoever they were, lived the ordinary life of working seafarers until they did not. Their lives before the incident were not mysterious. They woke and worked and ate and slept and thought about the ordinary things that people think about. The mystery came to them from outside, from wherever it came from, and ended the ordinary life without warning. What the mystery could not take from them was the life that preceded it, the months and years of watches stood, and routes completed and ports visited and colleagues known. There is a particular quality to ordinary life that only becomes visible in retrospect, when the ordinary is interrupted by something extraordinary. The ordinary life of the Ourang Medan's crew was not extraordinary in any way. It was the ordinary life of working people doing their work in the world, in the specific time and place that history assigned to them. The extraordinariness came from outside and ended the ordinary, and in ending it, made it visible in the way that things become visible when they are gone. Their ordinary lives are part of the story too, even if the story has largely forgotten to include them. The mystery requires the ordinary life to have preceded it. The horror, if there was horror, requires the normality it interrupts. A ship of working people, going about their work in the warm night of the strait, a cook in the galley, a helmsman on the bridge, men in the engine room attending to the machinery, the radio operator in the radio room monitoring the frequencies. And then the ordinary life ending, not dramatically, or at least not in the way that dramas are structured, not with a rising action and a climax that the characters can perceive as such, simply ending the way most things end, in the middle of something else, with no announcement, with no opportunity to say what you would have wanted to say if you had known it was ending. Sleep was part of that ordinary life, the deep, necessary sleep of working people, the sleep that the night watches made possible for half the crew while the other half stood watch. The sleep that will come to you now, as it came to them then, in the ordinary way that sleep comes, gradually without drama, carrying the body across the threshold from waking into rest. That threshold is available to you now. It requires nothing of you. It is simply there, patient, waiting for you to reach it in your own time. Stories that cannot be verified do not simply disappear. They find their level, the way water finds its level, settling into the particular niche in the human imagination that is shaped to receive them. The Ourang Medan has settled into the niche marked maritime mystery, ghost ship, inexplicable mass death, and has been comfortable there for more than 70 years, visited regularly by writers on unexplained phenomena, by maritime historians approaching it from varying degrees of skepticism, by the curious who encounter it in the course of reading about something else and find themselves staying longer than they intended. The story's staying power comes from several qualities that are worth identifying, not because identifying them dispels the mystery, but because understanding why a story persists tells you something about the people who keep returning to it, about what they need from it, about what it offers that other stories do not. The first quality is its completeness. The Ourang Medan story has all the elements of a satisfying narrative, a dramatic opening in the distress call, a mystery at its centre in the unexplained deaths, a climax in the explosion and sinking, and an ending that is both definitive and unresolved. The ship sank. The evidence went with it. The cause was never established. This is, structurally, a story that ends and does not end simultaneously. The external events conclude, but the internal questions remain permanently open. It is a story that gives you the experience of closure and the experience of irresolution at the same time, which is a rare and valuable thing in a narrative. The second quality is its specificity. The story offers particular details, the exact phrasing of the distress call, the positions of the dead bodies, the detail of the dog, the fire before the explosion, that give it the texture of something that was observed and reported rather than invented. Specific details are the evidence of either careful observation or careful invention, and from the outside, in the absence of documentation, they are often indistinguishable. The specificity creates the feeling of fact even in the absence of verified fact. The third quality is its unverifiability, which might seem like a weakness, but functions as a strength. A story that cannot be definitively verified cannot be definitively disproved. The absence of documentation that would confirm the Ourang Medan's existence is also the absence of documentation that would definitively establish it as a fiction. The uncertainty is not a failing of the story, but one of its features. It creates a permanent space for the question to live in, a space that cannot be closed off by any document that has yet been found. The fourth quality, perhaps the most important, is the story's responsiveness to the fears of its time. The post-war world, the world in which the Ourang Medan story first circulated, was a world processing the trauma of years of industrialized violence, a world that had seen chemical weapons used on a massive scale, a world that had discovered its own capacity for the production of death on a scale previously unimagined. A story about a ship killed by an invisible chemical agent in a world where such things were real and had been recently deployed spoke to something specific in the anxiety of that moment. The story has continued to speak to anxieties that shifted as the decades changed. In the Cold War years, the secret cargo theory resonated with fears about what governments were doing in secret, about the hidden world of intelligence and counterintelligence and the movement of dangerous materials across national boundaries. In the later 20th century, as environmental concerns grew, the methane theory found new relevance in discussions of seafloor geology and the hazards of fossil fuel extraction. Each era has found in the story the reflection of its own particular fears, which is one of the signs of a story that has achieved genuine cultural longevity. The story changes as the people who tell it change, becoming a vessel for whatever anxieties the present moment is carrying. What does the story speak to now, in the years since you first encountered it? Perhaps to the sense that the world is larger and stranger than the frameworks we use to understand it, that there are things that happen in the dark and the deep that our instruments and our records do not adequately capture. Perhaps to the particular modern anxiety about the fragility of documentation, the knowledge that even in an era of comprehensive digital record-keeping, things disappear, records are incomplete, events occur without leaving the trace that would allow them to be verified. Or perhaps the story speaks to something simpler and more fundamental, than any of these historical specificities. Perhaps it speaks to the awareness that the sea is very large and very old, and has absorbed a great many things that it has not returned. Every ship that has gone down since the first vessel was constructed has taken something to the bottom. Evidence of lives lived, evidence of cargoes carried, evidence of routes travelled. The floor of the ocean is an archive of the world's traffic, of its commerce and its conflicts and its accidents, and most of that archive is permanently inaccessible. We move on the surface of a world whose depths we cannot reach, and the depths hold more than we will ever know. The Ourang Medan, if it exists on the bottom of the Strait of Malacca, is part of that archive. It rests alongside whatever else the strait has received: the vessels of ancient traders, the warships of colonial powers, the fishing boats of local people, the debris of the 20th century's various destructions. It rests in the dark and the cold of the deep water, in a silence that is more complete than any silence available on the surface. In that silence, the questions that have attached themselves to the ship in its afterlife as a legend are irrelevant. The ship, if it is there, simply is there, indifferent to the stories told about it, indifferent to the theories proposed to explain it, indifferent to the investigators who have searched for its documentation and its wreck. And if it does not exist, if the ship is a legend without a referent, a story told by someone who heard it from someone who may have heard it from someone who made it up, then it exists in the archive of the stories people tell, which is a different kind of permanence but a permanence nonetheless. Stories that have been told for 70 years and survive the telling intact have a kind of existence that is real in its own way, that occupies space in the human world that a ship on the seafloor, however real, cannot occupy. The Ourang Medan has been both, perhaps, a possible ship and a certain story, a possible event and a definite cultural artifact. The possible ship may have carried its secrets to the bottom. The certain story has carried its mystery forward through time, arriving here in this night, in the quiet of this hour, where it delivers itself to you as it has delivered itself to everyone who has heard it, as a question that rests gently against the mind, that asks nothing more than to be held for a while before being set down. What you have received, in the course of this night, is not an answer. You knew, when you began, that there would be no answer. What you have received instead is the story in its fullness, the strait and its history, the distress call and its mystery, the boarding party and what they found, the theories and the investigations and the questions that resist resolution. You have received the company of the mystery, which is its own kind of gift. Set it down now. The story has been told. The mystery remains, as it always has, as it always will. And you are here, and the night is quiet, and there is nothing more required of you except the ordinary, necessary, beautiful act of sleeping. The Ourang Medan has given you what it has to give. The rest belongs to the water. Thank you so much for watching. If you would like to see more videos like this, please consider leaving a like and subscribing to the channel, as it really helps us continue making more content. Anyways, see you in the next one. The story has reached its edge now, not its end. The Ourang Medan has no end, in the way that mysteries have no ends. But the edge of what we can say about it, the place where language runs up against the limits of what is known. And this is a good place to be, as the night deepens and the hours pass and the body grows heavy with the weight of rest it has been carrying toward all evening. Let the strait settle around you. Let the dark water be dark and still and very far below. Let the story you have been carrying, the distress call, the boarding party, the faces of the dead, the explosion, the questions, let all of it grow quieter. Not silent, quite, still present, but softer now, the way the light grows softer in the hour before dawn, the way a conversation becomes quieter as the night progresses, the way everything eventually finds its way to a pace that can be breathed with. You are on the surface of the water. The water is calm tonight. The stars above the strait are the same stars that were above it in 1947, the same stars that have been above it for longer than there have been people to look at them. They have seen the ships come and go, the empires rise and fall, the stories told and retold and carried from one generation to the next. They keep their own counsel, the stars. They are very good at it. Below the surface, in the dark and the quiet of the deep water, things rest. All the things that have been carried down there by time and weight and the simple fact of gravity, which always wins in the end. Ships and their cargoes, stories and their secrets, the evidence of events that were real and the remains of legends that were not. All of it resting in the cold and the dark, in the perfect silence of the deep. You do not have to go down there. You can stay on the surface in the warm tropical night with the stars above you and the quiet water below, and the story complete enough for tonight, complete enough for sleep. Your breathing is slower now. It has been slowing for a while without any effort on your part, the way things slow when the conditions are right for slowing. The breath moves in, and the breath moves out, and the rhythm of it is the oldest rhythm there is, older than ships or seas or any story told about either, the rhythm that keeps you here in the world, breathing. The radio frequencies are quiet. No more transmissions tonight. The signal that came across the water in the dark has been received, has been carried through this story, has arrived at its listening. You are the listening, and the listening is done, and what remains is only the quiet frequency hum of the open channel, the static of the world at rest. "I die," said the voice on the radio, and then silence, and then all the ships that turned toward the signal, and all the people who heard the story, and all the years that carried the mystery forward. And now this, the dark of a night like any other night, the weight of a body settling into the surface that holds it, the breath slowing to the pace of rest, the mind releasing the last grip of the day's questions, letting them drift away like smoke, like sound, like radio signals travelling outward through the dark at the speed of light, growing softer with every passing second, reaching into the enormous dark of everything beyond. The Ourang Medan rests, in the story, in the strait, in whatever place stories go when their listeners finally sleep. You rest too. Sleep well. If you like this video, let me know where in the world you're watching from and what time it is. I'm always curious about that. And if you have a suggested topic, feel free to leave it in the comments. What do you think happened to the crew of the Ourang Medan? Was it a chemical cargo, a natural gas event from the seafloor, or something else entirely? Leave your theory in the comments below.